So we thank everybody for joining us in our class tonight. Last week we took a little break um, because of a um, tragedy that occurred in our church, and the lesson that we had prepared for last week just didn't seem appropriate for that situation. So we're back to Romans chapter 1 tonight, and we will be in verse 18 in just a few moments. Want to kind of go over a little bit about the what we've already been over. Um, in the first 17 verses of chapter 1 of Romans, basically Paul is talking about the gospel. He's introducing the letter of Romans that he's writing to the Christians who are in the city of Rome, somewhere in around mid first century, around 60, 65, somewhere along there, AD. He's writing to the church in Rome, of course, the seat of world government, Roman Empire, and the home of the Caesar that was in charge at the time. And so that's the more or less the historical background of what's going on in the background at the time of this particular writing. But he's trying to indicate to the believers in Rome the power of the gospel. And just by way of somewhat of a review, I'd just like to read Romans 1, 16, 17, and then 18 is where our study will be tonight. Paul says there, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. I'm a little bit distracted here for a moment. Let me get back to it. Let me start all over again. Okay, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it, that is in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed out of faith into faith, as it is written, those who are righteous by faith shall live. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. And then it begins to shift gears quite a bit as we move forward into the remaining part of chapter 1 and chapter 2, and in the first part of chapter 3. There's a shift in what appears to be a shift in subject matter when we get to verse 18. I'm going to suggest, however, that in a sense, it's not really a shift. It's just another part of what's already been taught, and that is the gospel. So on your screen, you probably can see the three parts of the gospel as stated in verses 16, 17, and 18, where Paul says there, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation. It is the power of God. And so we've spent a period of time, an entire lesson a few weeks ago, on how the gospel is the power of God. And I'll just say it this way, by way of just summing that up. There would be no salvation without what the gospel teaches. The gospel shows us God's power to save the whole world, to save all of us. There's no one going to be saved apart from the gospel. Whatever the gospel is, it is God's power to do what we cannot do for ourselves. It is God's power to make available to all men and all women, all people. It is his power to make available to all of us that which we could not do for ourselves. And when we get into this last part, the wrath of God, we're going to see why we could not do it for ourselves. The second part, though, is in verse 17, where it says, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. And so we talked about that. We spent a week also on that particular verse, verse 17. And the righteousness of God could mean many things. And we kind of broke it down into three things. It could mean the righteous characteristics of God. Righteousness is one of God's many characteristics. And so we would say God has the characteristics of love, holiness, patience. There are many characteristics that we could use to describe God, and righteousness is one of those. That is one way to interpret verse 17, his characteristics. The gospel reveals the characteristics of God. I don't disclaim that, but there may be more to it than that. A second way to understand the righteousness of God would be his righteous acts. Not only is he inherently righteous, but he does things that are righteous. And so his righteous acts would include creation. It would include casting Adam and Eve out of the garden after they sinned. All of these are acts of God in righteousness. And we could go throughout the entire Old Testament, the flood, just on and on and on, the Tower at Babel. We could name and point out to you many ways in which the righteousness of God acted itself out in human history. And certainly the coming of Jesus Christ himself, the incarnation, the death, and the resurrection would certainly be among the righteous acts of God. And so it could be, in this second thing, that what's being revealed in the gospel is the righteous acts of God. Well, certainly I can't deny that would be a real way to interpret it. But there's also a third possibility, and it seems to be contextually a little more to the point. It could be, though, that all three of these are revealed in the gospel. And I guess I would go on to say, yes, all three of these are revealed in the gospel. But the third one is God's gift of righteousness to us. Those of us, all of us who are not righteous, who are unrighteous, who are undeserving of his blessings and his mercy and his grace, and yet his righteousness comes to us as a gift. And so the salvation that is mentioned, the power of God unto salvation in verse 16, is restated as a gift of his righteousness to us. And we'll get into that in greater detail when we get into basically into end of chapter 3 and into chapter 4, where it says that faith is credited to us as righteousness. Our faith in Jesus Christ then becomes the vehicle through which the gift of God's righteousness comes to us, or the status of righteousness. Though we are not righteous, we are credited as if we are righteous by Jesus Christ through justification by faith. We'll get into that a whole lot more when we get into chapters 3 and 4. So that's our background. And so now we get into verse 18, where it says, the wrath of God is revealed. So the power of God is revealed in the gospel. The righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel. And then verse 18 says, now it is the wrath of God that is revealed from heaven. It does not specifically say there that the wrath of God is revealed in the gospel, but when it starts off with the word for, F-O-R, I don't know how your, verse 18, I don't know what is the first word in your translation, but it is a word pointing backwards to what he just said. And so what he just said is still on the table when he says this. So the gospel is the power of God, the righteousness of God, and now it includes the wrath of God. And we would go, now what is what is the good news related to the wrath of God? How can the wrath of God be gospel or be good news? Well, that's our challenge for tonight, to try and see if we can work through that. So first of all, let's look at how verse 17 and verse 18 are stated as parallel statements. So the verse 17 says, the righteousness of God is revealed. Then verse 18 says, the wrath of God is revealed. Almost the same wording, just changed the word righteousness to the word wrath. So this also points to the fact that Paul is still dealing with the same subject. And that subject is the gospel, the gospel that he's not ashamed of, the gospel that he is obligated to share. And so in the gospel is these elements. It is the power of God to those who believe. So faith is an element of the gospel. Salvation is an element of the gospel. Righteousness is an element of the gospel. And now it seems that the wrath of God is also an element of the teaching of the gospel. And so we're going to try to see how this works itself out. So I've got a few quotes that came from one of the commentaries that I read. So I'm going to put these on the screen and I'm going to read them because the word wrath carries with it in English some very severe connotations. And the question becomes, is God wrathful, vengeful? Is God an angry God in the way that we understand vengeance and anger and wrath from a human perspective? And I would first of all say, no, God is not human. God is above humanity, and therefore what we might consider human anger and human wrath would not necessarily describe God's wrath. And so right off the bat, we should not try to define God in human terms. So here's a quote from a commentary. We must look not to the lower, irrational kind of human anger, but to the higher kind, the indignation against injustice, cruelty, and corruption, which is an essential element of goodness and love in a world in which moral evil is present. I hope that makes sense to you as we read it. If it's on the screen, you can read through it again. So when we talk about the wrath of God, this commentator is saying, don't look at it as an irrational emotion, like somebody offends you and you got to get them back, and you get angry and you boil over and you pay them back. Well, God's wrath is not so much payback as it is God's response to the injustice and the cruelty and the corruption of the world. When God created the world, over and over and over in those 6 days of creation, in each of the 6 days, when he reflected back upon what was created on that particular day, he said it's good. Creation was good. And in many ways, creation today still is good. And yet, because of sin and because of rebellion and because of stubbornness and selfishness, the world that we live in is just simply corrupt. And therefore, it is the corruption and the cruelty of men against men, the injustice that is inflicted upon not only humanity, but often injustice that is inflicted upon the animal kingdom, the environment, on and on and on, which God said was good, and now we have corrupted it. And so God has a response to that. the word that is used here is wrath, because that's the English translators chose that word to translate the Greek word that's there. But it's not, I do not think it should be looked upon as a human response. When someone offends me, then I'm so angered that I have to retaliate. I don't think the wrath of God is a retaliation. God never loses control. An angry person is a person out of control, who is controlled by anger. God is never controlled by his anger, nor is he ever controlled by his wrath. He does have a response to sin. And in this case, it is referred to as the wrath of God. As long as we understand, there's a significant difference, I believe, in when we say the wrath of God, and we would say the wrath of someone else, the wrath of some nation who's retaliating against another nation that has invaded them, or something along that line. Another quote: the wrath of men is always comprised by the presence of sin in the one who is wroth or wrathful, whereas the wrath of God is the wrath of him who is perfectly loving and perfectly good. So the word perfect is important there. The perfect God cannot and does not and will not ever tolerate sin. And so there's a response to that. And so again, in this case, the choice of the wording is the wrath of God is the response, the adverse response to sin. Other quotes, let's see, that the two revelations referred to in these two verses, that is the righteousness of God and the wrath of God, the two revelations are really two aspects of the same process. The preaching of Christ crucified, risen, ascended, and coming again is at the same time both the offer to men of a status of righteousness before God and the revelation of God's wrath against their sin. So in the gospel, the divine mercy and the divine judgment are inseparable from each other. It is because of the divine judgment that mercy is necessary. Those are my words. Again, it is because of the divine judgment against rebellion that mercy is necessary. And so they are pretty much the heads and tails of the same coin. They must be talked about together. And this is exactly what Paul is going to do. He's going to spend the entire rest of chapter 1, all of chapter 2, and part of chapter 3 talking about his judgment against sin. All right, and I think this is the last one. The reality of the wrath of God is only known when it is seen in its revelation in Gethsemane and on Golgotha. We'll talk some more about that, especially Golgotha. The wrath of God was poured out in Gethsemane, but more so at Calvary. The wrath of God was dealt with. We sing songs that say the wrath of God was satisfied. I don't know sometimes what that means, but I do know that that it is the treachery, the horrible nature of the cross. It is the picture of the wrath of God being perpetrated on his own son for the behalf of the whole world. Therefore, this is one thing that we have to just keep in mind always, that because whatever happened at Calvary included all of us. Once it was finished, and Jesus said at the end, he said, "It is finished." So once whatever took place at Calvary It was finished, and it was finished for all of us. And so in one way, in one sense of understanding, the wrath of God has been totally satisfied on the person of Jesus Christ. This is part of grace. And trying to unpack that and trying to understand that could take the rest of our life trying to figure all the implications of that. I'm barely touching the surface in my own understanding of what all that means. One day, I think we'll know exactly what it means when we see the Lord face to face and we go, oh, that's what you did. Oh, that's what you meant. And we'll fall on our face in so total gratitude. And yet today, I think we've got some limitations to our understanding. Okay, moving on. So rather than using the term wrath, because I think the term wrath or the anger of God carries with it some unpleasant connotations that maybe we need to avoid, because God is different from us. His wrath is different from mine. His anger is different from mine. It's not the same. But if we impose on him my definition of wrath or my definition of anger, I think we mess up. So maybe there's a few other words we could use. So I've come up with a couple of things here. The wrath of God is the extreme displeasure of God towards sin. It is in the character of God, in the righteousness of God. The righteousness of God cannot tolerate sin. It's just not tolerable in any shape, form, or fashion. God is displeased with sin. God is displeased with our sinful behavior. And so, in a sense, if we can picture an extreme displeasure of God, this to me helps a little bit to understand his wrath. And the other word I would use is his opposition. So the wrath of God represents the opposition of God to certain things. And so it's specifically stated here in verse 18 that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. It doesn't say here that the wrath of God is extended against men. It says, if we read it, we just read what it says. It says that the wrath of God is revealed against the actions of men in their ungodliness and their unrighteousness. It is their ungodliness and their unrighteousness that the wrath of God, the displeasure of God, the opposition of God goes against. Now, that does not mean that men will not and do not suffer because of his displeasure. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. But the opposition of God, the wrath of God is his opposition to anything that is sinful, ungodly, and unrighteous, and anyone who is an opponent of the truth. And so that also is stated there in verse 18. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. So the wrath of God is to be revealed against deception and lying and anything that is an opponent of truth. So as we proceed into chapter 1, and we're not going to get very far. We're not going to get much further than this tonight. One verse. You've come to expect that, I'm sure. But we will next week begin to unpack the rest of chapter 1, which goes into great detail as to what he's talking about here. Those who suppress the truth, who hold the truth back, who refuse to allow the truth of God to penetrate into their lives in order to bless them and bring them closer in relationship to Him. So wrath is His displeasure. Wrath is His opposition to those things, all things that oppose Him. All enemies of God will experience His wrath, His actions against them, His judgment against them, his work of humility or bringing them into submission. This is all a part of the wrath of God. So the wrath of God is against the choices and the actions of people who refuse to come to the truth. Okay, let's see what else we can come up with. And so the wrath of God is revealed. It says the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against these things. Well, how is it revealed? And I've just come up with my own a list of things here, and certainly it could be much longer than this. How is the wrath of God revealed? The wrath of God is revealed in the consequences of our actions. When we do something wrong, there will be consequences to that action. Unless someone comes in and tries to fix things for us, then when we make mistakes and we do things wrong, even when we do it unknowingly, when we sin or we make mistakes unknowingly, there's still going to be consequences to those bad choices. We are given the free will. People want to spend a lot of time talking about free will of humanity. We have the free will to make our own choices. And yes, we do. To a certain extent, we do. I think it's more limited than we think it is. And I don't mean God limits it. I think our ignorance limits our choices. If we knew the full truth, if we could see the whole picture, we might make better choices, but we're limited sometimes in our choice, in what we perceive to be our choices. And so because of that limitation, we also have limited free will sometimes. We have free will within the boundaries of what we know, but we don't know everything. Therefore, there are other choices that we've never considered, maybe. You can ponder that on another day. But the consequences of sin. And so what God does, and what we're going to see very clearly in the verses to follow, is that when mankind chooses to rebel, it says God gives them up. It will say that 3 times coming up in the verses yet to come in this chapter. 3 times it says God gives them up. It doesn't mean God gives up on them. That's not what it says. It says God gives them up, and it says God gives them up to their choices. God gives them up to the consequences of their choices. In other words, He doesn't try to fix it for them. He lets them make their choice, and then they have to live out the consequences of that choice. And in those consequences, the wrath of God is revealed. It's revealed in the fact that you've made a poor choice. The wrath of God is revealed because those consequences are not pleasant. They're not complimentary. They don't always help us. They hurt us. But God allows that to happen. And so that's part of His displeasure with sin, is that He lets us suffer as a result of our poor choices. He doesn't intervene in the process. But that's a blessing. It's a blessing because He doesn't enable us what he does is, okay, you want to act this way? Well, go ahead. This is fine. You live this way. You make this choice, but you'll suffer the consequences of that choice. And then you'll wish you hadn't done it. And you'll learn the lesson. And so that leads us to our second point here, that the wrath of God is often revealed through his discipline, his disciplinary action. And so we've studied this in other types of lessons where what is punishment? What is the eternal punishment of God? Is it punitive? Is it punishment for punishment's sake? You did this, therefore you'll suffer the penalty for the rest of your life. Or is the punishment disciplinary that has a purpose? Yes, it's unpleasant. Yes, it creates unpleasant situations and things that we wished we didn't have to go through. But it is for growth purposes. It is for teaching lessons. It is for us to never do that again. We made this choice and this is what happened. Now we've learned a lesson, and so we're not going to do that again. And God reveals his wrath in allowing us to be disciplined. But I think he reveals his mercy in that he doesn't let that destroy us. And then the third thing that I think that we can say the wrath of God is revealed in certainly is in the work of Christ on the cross. The wrath of God is certainly the importance of accountability for sin. There would be no need for the cross. Or I'll put it another way, the horrible nature of the cross tells us the horrible nature of sin and it's damaging us in our relationship with God. God paid an awful price through Jesus. Jesus paid an awful price so that our bad choices, our bad decisions could be dealt with in a positive way. So one of the things that I want to try to show you here is that the wrath of God can be good news. It initially is not good news. It's accountability. It's displeasure. It is dealing harshly with the corruption that's in my life, the evil that I've allowed into my own life and my own decision making. It's harshly dealt with. God doesn't take sin lightly, but his wrath is extended against my rebelliousness. But the good news is it can be for a good purpose. It can be for a positive purpose. And so therefore, we can see it as good news. Okay, we've already looked at this slide, I think. The wrath of God is about perspective. It is about, the perspective is wrath punitive? That is, you did this, now you'll suffer this. It's just payback. If the wrath of God was nothing more than payback, it would not be good news. And in fact, we would also have to question whether the wrath of God negated the love of God, if it was just merely punitive. But it's not necessarily only punitive. It is restorative. The wrath of God comes against our evil behavior so as to make us better in the long run, so that we might grow and become children of God in the powerful sense that it's meant to be. Okay, so I should have, but I didn't. I didn't put these up one at a time, so you get to see them all at once. We're going to summarize this as we conclude the lesson tonight. And what we'll do is look forward to going into greater detail on many of these things as we unpack the verses yet to come here in chapter 1 and into chapter 2. So here's a couple of things that we can look at in summary tonight. God is angry at sin, but he never ceases to love the sinner. I think that is crucial for us to understand, because if he was angry at the sinner, there would be no gospel. If he was angry at the sinner, there would be no power of God unto salvation, because there would be no salvation. If God was simply angry because we made bad decisions, there would be no way out. There would be no grace. There would only be punishment. So God's anger is real, but it is, let's try to place it at the right source. God is angry with sin. God is angry with corruption and evil, and it has infiltrated our lives, and he's angry at that. But he still loves me. He's never ceased to love me or to love you. He never ceases to love us as sinners, and that's why the grace of God is available, because he loves us. Second, the cross is the definitive statement of the wrath of God against sin. I've tried to make this point 2 or 3 times tonight already. It is at the cross where the wrath of God, as I said, sometimes we sing it, the wrath of God is satisfied. The wrath of God played itself out to its fullest extent when every sin of every human being was nailed to the cross of Jesus Christ. All of his wrath was focused on that, on his son on the cross, so that you and I bear it no longer. This is an amazing thing for us to grasp. We bear it no longer because he bore it for us. That's good news. The good news that the wrath of God is real, but it no longer applies to me in the relationship that I now have with God by faith. I hope you'll wrestle with that. I hope, because I feel sometimes I don't articulate it clearly. I kind of got an idea of what I think I mean by this, but I'm not sure I state it clearly. So I hope you'll wrestle with this, that his wrath was poured out. It's already been poured out on the cross when Jesus bore the sins of every human being. Thirdly, the cross is the place where the wrath of God and the love of God come together. And that's good news. It's not either or. It's not that we are going to receive the wrath of God or we're going to receive the love of God. We're going to receive the love of God. And the reason that we received the love of God is because the wrath of God has been satisfied already at the cross. And so the love of God, the love of God is revealed in his pouring out his wrath at the cross. That was the most loving thing this God could possibly do. Therefore, he spares me and he spares you that infliction. As we come to him over and over, it says in Romans, as we come to him, as we respond to him in faith, the work of the cross negates, and it says that, we'll say that in a minute, or the next very one. Let's look at it. At the cross, love is validated, wrath is negated. At the cross, love is validated. The love of God is validated. The wrath of God is negated at the cross of Jesus. That is the teaching of the gospel that Paul is preaching. That is what it's all about. That's why it is good news. And it is good news. That's how we can take the wrath of God and turn it into something positive. That's how we can say that even the teachings of the wrath of God is part of the good news gospel. because wrath is negated. We're told, we sing songs. He bore our sins, and we bear them no more. I think that's in the song, one of our favorite songs. It is well. My sin, oh, the bliss of this glorious thought. My sin, not in part, but the whole, is nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more. That is to say, the wrath of God has been satisfied through the cross and the love of God. It is an amazing story. It is all about good news. And finally, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed so that the wrath of God is not experienced. In the gospel, the righteousness of God and the power of God unto salvation works over the wrath of God so that we do not have to experience the wrath of God. We will not experience the wrath of God because of the gospel, because of the power of God unto salvation, because of the righteousness of God out of his faithfulness into our faith. We no longer experience his wrath. This is a powerful, powerful teaching, in my opinion. And now we're going to go into next week and following. We're going to go into a prolonged period that we might consider pretty negative, because Paul's going to deal straight up with sin and straight up with it, and it's going to cover half of chapter 1, all of chapter 2, and half of chapter 3. I will probably not go as slow through those verses as we have gone through the first 18. I don't want to deal with everything in that detail because it's negative and it's a downer. I don't want to spend that much time just being in the downside, because we get to the middle of chapter 3 and the end of chapter 3, it gets positive, and that's where we want to go. That's where we want to get. But we can't really understand fully the positive nature of the gospel unless we understand the negative part. And that is why the gospel is necessary. And the gospel is necessary because we're all sinners. And because we're sinners, the love of God had to do something. God had to act, and he did act on our behalf. But we have to come to a conclusion that we're not perfect, and that we don't deserve this. And so Paul deals very strongly and very detailed with the sinful nature of all humanity. So get ready for some, I'll try to make them as positive lessons as possible, but there's some negativity in these next few verses, a lot of it. And yet we have to face it. We have to be confronted by it. The world needs to know that. Hopefully we had a good lesson tonight. Hopefully it was a blessing to you. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you then next week.